Two grand allies of World War II, the United States and the Soviet Union, fought together bravely and courageously against fascism, but later turned into enemies. Their different ideologies turned the world and space into a battlefield. It was a war unlike any other. A war between two former allies. A war between two economic systems. Capitalism versus communism. A war between two ways of life. Freedom versus oppression. The Cold War. The United States and Soviet Union waged the Cold War from the depths of the oceans to the expanse of space for more than 4 decades. 40 years of uncertainty and fear of nuclear disaster.
Tear down this wall.
Political personalities who led the front came to be known as the Cold Warriors. Welcome to the Cold Warrior Hall of Fame, where the war is just about to turn hot. Harry Truman was born in Lamar, Missouri, and grew up in Independence, Missouri. He attended the University of Missouri Kansas City School of Law. Initially, he became a farmer, then a judge in 1922, and a senator in 1934. He was Roosevelt's running mate in 1944, but was kept in the dark about vital events. Finally, he was plunged into the presidency on April 12, 1945, when, in his words, the moon, the stars, and the planets fell upon him. After Britain could no longer provide aid to Greece, Truman gave a speech and issued his doctrine, the Truman Doctrine, which asked for $400 million in aid to Greece and Turkey, as well as other threatened democracies. It was one of America's first containment measures, and looking back, the Truman Doctrine set the basis for America's containment policies in the Cold War. Soon after, the Marshall Plan was passed. This plan funded recovery in war-torn Western Europe, thus increasing America's influence there. It worked by lending money to European countries so that they could buy American goods. The plan was a success in both making Europe self-reliant and containing communism. On June 25, 1950, war broke out between North and South Korea, and North Korean troops headed towards Seoul. Without a Soviet delegate, the UN Security Council condemned the invasion and sent a force to retaliate against the North Koreans. The force was comprised mostly of American soldiers and was led by General Douglas MacArthur. MacArthur planned one of the greatest amphibious assaults in naval history, but the war still ended with a stalemate. The effects of the Cold War still remain alive today in the division of Korea. Lastly, Truman oversaw the Berlin airlift. The situation was caused by the Soviets blocking access to West Berlin, leaving the citizens helpless. President Truman ordered American military to support the citizens by flying in supplies, in an operation codenamed Operation Vittles. Planes delivered food and fuel to break the Soviets' blockade of Berlin until the Soviets finally gave in. Harry Truman was a quintessential aspect of the Cold War as he was the first president to fight it. Although his predecessor, FDR, was one of America's greatest presidents, Truman held his ground by issuing the Truman Doctrine, which gave aid to Greece and Turkey. Secondly, he also expanded this aid to any nation in need by issuing the Marshall Plan. Truman really set the basis for all future Cold War presidents with his policies.
Our next inductee is George F. Kennan, one of the most avid American diplomats who traveled the world during the Cold War. Kennan grew up in Wisconsin and attended St. John's Military Academy and Princeton University. At the peak of his career, he was the United States ambassador to the Soviet Union. It is there that he wrote his famous long telegram, which expressed the doctrine of containment. In 1946, the State Department received an 8,000-word long telegram written by Kennan from Moscow, wherein he criticized Moscow and asserted that Soviet fanaticism made even a temporary understanding impossible. However, he believed that the Soviet Union would back down if any resistance was present. In July 1947, after returning to the United States, he published an article named Sources of Soviet Misconduct in the magazine Foreign Policy as Mr. X. This article gave a name to the direction to which the US foreign policy will go towards during the Cold War, the doctrine of containment. In it, Kennan advocated a policy of firm containment and to confront Russian aggression with immense counterforce every time they tried to spread communism around the world. This doctrine was used to justify US intervention in Korea, Vietnam, and Afghanistan. These costly wars shook the nation and questioned the heavy cost of containment put upon the United States.
The Cold War Hall of Fame inducts those people who were avid participants of the war that raged on for almost 40 years. George F. Kennan was one of the most influential American diplomats, and his doctrine of containment became a cornerstone of US foreign policy for almost 40 years. It is possible to say that he was so influential that each succeeding president, after President Truman, adopted a version of his policy of containment and made it their own.
Born in 1917 in Massachusetts, John Fitzgerald Kennedy was raised in a wealthy family. He attended Harvard College and Stanford University and later joined the US Navy in World War II. Unfortunately, he was a sickly child, and his back injuries caused by an attack hindered his ability to fully participate in the House of Representatives and the Senate. In 1953, he married Jackie Kennedy, and in 1960, he became the youngest elected president in US history. One of his legacies was the way he dealt with the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962, which was a 13-day confrontation between the US and the Soviet Union. As a result of the Bay of Pigs invasion on Cuba, Khrushchev deployed nuclear missiles to Cuba to deter future attacks, and Kennedy resorted to a naval quarantine. Fortunately, this was a success. On October 28th, they compromised, and the US promised not to invade Cuba. They later established a hotline from Kremlin to Washington, D.C. to prevent incidents like this from happening again. Kennedy's I Am a Berliner speech, also known as the West Berlin speech, emphasized the United States' support for West Berlin after the Berlin Wall was constructed. It gave a morale boost for the West Berlin and discouraged Khrushchev from taking over it. In June of 1963, Kennedy gave the speech, A Strategy of Peace, where he proclaimed support towards early agreement on a comprehensive test ban treaty. Finally, in October 1963, Kennedy signed the Nuclear Test Ban Treaty. This prohibited the detonation of nuclear weapons everywhere except underground. It was proposed because of the concerns of radioactive fallout underwater and in the atmosphere.
Kennedy had a large role in the cool-down of the Cold War. It was because of his diplomacy that he managed to cool down the Cuban Missile Crisis. He willingly listened to his advisors and also willingly communicated with the Soviet Union. This led to a breakthrough in nuclear testing, which led to the Nuclear Test Ban Treaty after 8 years.
John Foster Dulles, born in 1888 to a family of statesmen, became one of the key architects of US foreign policy for almost a decade under President Eisenhower. His diplomatic skills are evident when he accompanied the US delegation to the Versailles Peace Conference, helped prepare the United Nations Charter, and negotiated a peace treaty with Japan following the end of World War II. As Secretary of State, he left an indelible mark upon US history. From the get-go of his term, he criticized the policy of containment, of being too defensive a stance against communism. His critical views are expressed in his book, War or Peace. Instead, he favored a policy of rollback of Soviet power by threatening massive retaliation if Soviet Union took any aggressive action. One of his most successful accomplishments were the formation of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, and the Southeast Asia Treaty Organization, SEATO. NATO became an instrument to deter Soviet expansion because with it, Dulles had the capability of threatening massive retaliation in the event of war. His brother Allen Dulles was a CIA director. Their partnership was instrumental in breaking down the rule of Mohammad Mossadegh, who tried to nationalize the oil industry of Iran and effectively destroyed the spread of communism in that country. Dulles believed neutrality during the Cold War to be immoral. This ideology was unacceptable to the Arab nationalist Gamal Abdel Nasser, leader of Egypt. When Nasser declared neutrality, Dulles tried to put economic pressure on Egypt and refused to build the Aswan Dam. In response, Nasser nationalized the Suez Canal, and Dulles as his policy of economic pressure backfired. This showed that although Dulles wanted to destroy communism, he could only contain it, like his predecessors and eventually his successors. Finally, Dulles helped President Eisenhower formulate the Eisenhower Doctrine, which stated that the United States would help any other nation being attacked by communism if it asked for help.
During the 1950s, the Cold War turned hot, and John Foster Dulles, as Secretary of State, was one of the most important, if not the most important, Cold War policy implementer under President Dwight Eisenhower. He was responsible for the creation of NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization that unified 12 North Atlantic nations and that expressed the principle of collective self-defense to prevent and stop Soviet expansion. The history claims John Foster Dulles as the person who brought the United States at the brink of nuclear disaster. Although it might be true, he was really pragmatic and flexible in his foreign policy, which is proven by declassified historical documents. Thus, he gave the United States an edge in the Cold War by threatening the use of nuclear disaster, but never using it.
Nikita Khrushchev was one of the most powerful Soviet Cold Warriors and was destined for the role when he rose to the premiership in 1958. In general, as a premier, he criticized Stalin's leadership and strove for cooperation between communism and capitalism. One of Khrushchev's first direct encounters with a high-level United States politician was during the kitchen debate, where Khrushchev and Vice President Richard Nixon had a friendly exchange between the merits of democracy and communism. Nixon demonstrated the new color television sets, showing America's advanced technology, and told Khrushchev to not be afraid of ideas. After all, you don't know everything. Khrushchev countered, saying, "You don't know anything about communism, except fear of it." Nikita Khrushchev also approved the construction of the Berlin Wall to stop East Germans from fleeing into West Germany. After it was built, it completely stopped the flow of Berliners from east to west, as travelers were rarely ever allowed to cross. The east side of the 4-foot-wide wall was fortified with vicious dogs, tripwire machine guns, and soldiers. On May 1st, 1960, a U-2 spy plane crashed inside the Soviet Union, and Moscow took credit for shooting it down. Its pilot, Francis Gary Powers, was put on display, along with the pictures he had taken. When Khrushchev demanded an apology, the United States declined. In the Paris summit of May 16, 1960, Khrushchev launched into a tirade and took a hard stance against the United States, increasing tensions of the Cold War. One of Khrushchev's most important roles, though, was in the Cuban Missile Crisis. After the failed Bay of Pigs invasion, Fidel Castro felt threatened and allowed the Soviet Union to plant nuclear missiles inside Cuba. When the United States blocked off shipments to the island and demanded that the missiles be removed, Khrushchev agreed as long as the U.S. promised not to invade Cuba. However, the second day he sent a counteroffer, agreeing to remove the missiles only if America removed its own Jupiter missiles from Turkey. Kennedy publicly ignored the second message and accepted the first, but later agreed to secretly remove the Jupiter missiles. To facilitate future communication, a direct phone line was established between Washington and Moscow.
Being the Soviet premier during the presidencies of Truman, Eisenhower, and Kennedy, Nikita Khrushchev was a necessary addition to the Hall of Fame. He was much more willing than his predecessor Stalin to compromise, and because of this, he signed the Nuclear Test Ban Treaty. In fact, considering his capacity for diplomacy, Khrushchev could have reached a compromise much sooner if not for the U-2 spy plane incident, and ended the Cold War.
Ho Chi Minh was born in French Indochina in 1890. He had 3 siblings, and as a young child, he studied Chinese and Vietnamese in preparation for his Confucianism studies. He attended Comintern in Moscow, which was hosted by Lenin. In 1930, he founded the Indo-Chinese Communist Party, and in 1941, he founded Viet Minh. Ho Chi Minh's communist government regime started in the August Revolution of 1945, during which he and the Viet Minh attempted to claim Vietnamese independence. Through 1945, the Viet Minh had extended their numbers and support in the north, with the weakened French and distracted Japanese unable to stop them. On August 19th, Viet Minh forces captured the capital, Hanoi, and on August 25th, Bảo Đại abdicated the throne. The next day, the Communist Party of Vietnam began to plan its proclamation of independence. This led to the Proclamation of Independence of Democratic Republic of Vietnam. He began requesting the Politburo to send aid to Viet Cong's uprising in South Vietnam after he realized that the nationwide elections would never happen. The Politburo was the highest policy-making government authority under the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. This further escalated tensions between North and South Vietnam. Finally, he allowed Viet Cong to execute the Tet Offensive, which was a series of invasions on control centers in South Vietnam. Although they were defeated, it was a political defeat for the United States as public support for the war drastically decreased.
Ho Chi Minh led a vital role in the Vietnam War. It was because of his influence that North Vietnam joined communism. He also actively fought for North Vietnam's independence. It's entirely possible that if he didn't lead North Vietnam, the Vietnam War would have never occurred.
A cloud hides the sky. A nuclear shadow falls across the human future.
I believe that it must be the policy of the United States to support free peoples who are resisting attempted subjugation by armed minorities or by outside pressures. The free peoples of the world look to us for support in maintaining their freedom. If we falter in our leadership, we may endanger the peace of the world, and we shall surely endanger the welfare of this nation.